Thanks everybody for coming. This, by the way, is not a sort of academic paper at all. It's really just a sort of happy story about my book, what I learned, how it came to be, and what I learned. And I didn't realize that this book would end up being, I guess, so popular and so important to so many people. It's now into its second printing. And I've been talking about the book all over the world. And it turns out that everywhere that journalists are having problems, people really want to hear my sort of message about investigative and campaigning journalism. So Global Muckraking, and I know you all know who the muckrakers are, was my editor's title for this book. It's basically a collection of pieces of campaigning, investigative, human rights journalism from around the world over the last 150 years. And nobody has ever brought together journalism from developing countries in this way before. And the book got started because Richard John at Columbia University asked me to teach a course with him in the PhD program that would be a history of economic journalism in Africa, around the world actually, since 1600. And Richard told me, any of you who know Richard John know that Richard reads everything. He's a huge reader. I'm a bookworm too. And he told me that my job would be Africa and India. And I thought, oh my God, you know, I don't have a PhD. I'm gonna have to teach PhD students. Like, what the hell am I gonna do? And so I just started reading everything I could. And as I started reading, I found so many interesting things that I decided, okay, I have to put together a book. So that's how the book was born. And as you can see, and as I was doing this, I went to my editor and I thought that the book would be a collection of essays about journalism that made a difference. And I thought, I approached New Press, I said, why don't you do like 15 essays about journalism that made a difference? And my editor said, no, you've got to have excerpts from the actual journalism, which I thought no one's gonna wanna read that because old-fashioned journalism is old-fashioned journalism. He said, you have to. So it grew and grew and grew. And it became 47 pieces of journalism from around the world over the last 150 years. And then I thought, no one's going to understand this, so I have to have little introductions that explain why the pieces mattered and put them in context. And talk about if they had an impact or didn't have an impact. And so then that meant finding people to write all those essays. So it ended up being 47 essays with introductions written by like 40 different people. So that's sort of what the book is. And again, because this was mostly supposed to be developing country journalism, the themes of the book are the themes that were in developing country newspapers and magazines and pamphlets. So stuff like, you know, anti-colonialism, right, which obviously we wouldn't have seen as much of in the US or Europe, but was really, really important. Vietnam, lots of countries, India. Slavery and trafficking, again, a contemporary subject, but really important in the 19th century. Human rights violations committed by the military. So we have pieces from Chile and Turkey and Brazil, for example, and South Africa. Rural poverty, obviously. So anyway, you get the idea. So this is not what you would see necessarily in the New York Times. I just show this picture because I like this picture. To put together the book, I hired 5 researchers, including Vanessa Pope. Young people, researchers that spoke Turkish and Swahili and French and Spanish. And when I was in the British Library, I came across this. And one of the things I say in my introduction is that in developing countries, people often know about development communications, communications for development, but they don't necessarily know about their own tradition of investigative or sort of campaigning journalism. And this is from Ghana from 1961. And as you know, Kwame Nkrumah believed in a sort of new form of journalism for a Pan-African form of journalism that would take over after colonialism. So this is the strong African journalist holding the fountain pen, vanquishing the dollar and the pound, and breaking free of his chains against the continent of Africa. So I love that picture. And I just found it one day at the British Library, so I like to show it. This as well, you can see the changes that took place in the Ghanaian media after independence. This is 1968. Journalists urged to educate the public. So a lot of that kind of stuff started appearing. A very sort of utilitarian view of the press. It's supposed to help promote growth and economic development, just to bring people together. This would not be dissimilar to much of what you saw in China, for example, or the Soviet Union or Vietnam, even today in the Singaporean media. So that's a little background. Here's just, because I show this talk to so many young people who've never looked at old newspapers, I like to show some old newspapers. So this is the Calcutta Gazette. And again, none of this will be surprising to you, the advertisements on the front, the ships full of opium going to China, the quirky, random, blog-like nature of the 19th century newspapers, you know, some long parliamentary coverage about toilets for coolies next to a letter from London about how everybody's reading Middlemarch this season. There are so many things I just enjoyed so much. Reading an article in the Calcutta papers about the traffic jam on the Howrah Bridge with horse and carriages, and then I got out, took a cab, got stuck in a traffic jam on the same bridge. Ghana, we found a little announcement from someone saying, you know, I beg leave to inform my neighbors I'm not going to lend out my chairs anymore. Letters from people say in Nigeria, you know, why don't young people today listen to more African music, or why do they speak in such loud voices? So it's fun going through all this kind of quirky random stuff. And again, as you know, when you read history, you decide you become a history bore. So my sort of take was, gee, the 19th century is kind of like blogs. Who knew? And this I also, again, point out to the young people when I lecture that these collections are not digitized and they're falling apart. So this was, again, Calcutta Amrita Bazar Patrika is one of the really important Bengali newspapers in Bengal. So I like to remind everyone it's going, and it's not going to be going for good. So has everybody here read King Leopold's Ghost? Okay, good. Have you read it? No, I'm not telling you so. Okay, so there I was reading and reading and reading in order to teach this class with Richard John, and really kind of wondering what the hell I was going to teach. And I came upon King Leopold's Ghost, and I suddenly thought, this is it, my problems are solved. Adam Hochschild, who everybody knows, former publisher of Mother Jones, family comes from mining backgrounds, who's written a lot on slavery and mining, wrote King Leopold's Ghost, which was about the battle to help the Congolese fight for better conditions on the rubber plantations during the time period that the Congo was owned by King Leopold. As you all know, there was a huge demand for rubber in the late 19th century. Vulcanization was invented, new bicycles were invented, cars were invented, so there's a huge global demand for rubber. And the conditions under which rubber were produced were extremely brutal, and nowhere worse than in the Congo, which was owned by King Leopold. And as you also know, there's a big debate about when did human rights start, right? Modern human rights movement. Some people say it was sort of the campaign for Soviet Jewry. Some people will tell you that it was Eleanor Roosevelt. Adam Hochschild argues that the anti-slavery movements and the abolitionists were the first modern human rights movement. And that what happened was, after slavery was officially abolished, you had all of these abolitionists and missionaries and journalists who are all kind of revved up to keep fighting these campaigns. So he argues that the campaign of E.D. Morel for better conditions in the Congo was a modern human rights campaign, which was rooted in the anti-slavery campaign. And what made this interesting from the point of view of my class was he puts the journalist E.D. Morel sort of squarely in the role of one of the great campaigners, and sort of gives a role for journalism. And I thought, okay, this is enough, since I have to teach about it. So we can argue this is economic journalism, and here's a business journalist doing something good. So this is it. This is where I'm starting. So I ended up using the book to teach. And part of what was so interesting about Hochschild's perspective is that so many of the tactics were so modern. So E.D. Morel starts a newspaper, starts campaigning for better conditions in the Congo, to get King Leopold out of the Congo. King Leopold responds just like people do today. He hired PR people, he hired lobbyists, he hired lawyers, he tried to bribe the journalists, he tried to scare the journalists. The journalists had a really hard time actually getting information about what was going on, and that's a theme that will keep coming up throughout the book. The whole problem of verification was extremely difficult. just as the journalist today in the Cameroon or Ghana who wants to cover environmental degradation, at a coal mine can't get there unless the mining company takes her. So these people who wanted to know what was happening on the Amazon or in the Congo for the rubber workers couldn't get there basically because the boats were controlled by the colonialists unless they traveled with missionaries. And the missionaries had their own boats, so a lot of information actually came out through the missionaries. So yeah, the King Leopold hated the campaign against him. He even published his own magazine called The Truth About the Congo, which he started, which he put in the, if you've read King Leopold's Ghost, you remember that scene, he puts it in the seat pockets of the overnight train to Brussels. And hilariously, a couple years ago, I actually met, I think it was the Crown Prince of Belgium, and at a conference, and I said to him, "Oh, have you read King Leopold's Ghost? Did you like it?" And he said to me, "That was a terrible book. I have some pamphlets I can send you." I thought, okay, here we are 140 years later, and they're still, or 120 years later, they're still doing it. So some of the characters in King Leopold's Ghost are George Washington Williams, a free American slave who raised money to start his own newspaper, actually went to the Congo and investigated, wrote an open letter to King Leopold, which you can still find online. No one really paid much attention to him. British Consul Roger Casement here and also in The Question of the Amazon was sent out by the British to verify what was going on and to do his own research. I don't know if any of you know anything about Casement. He's a fascinating character. He was an Irish nationalist. He ended up being executed for treason because he sided with Germany in World War I. Afterwards, the British government suddenly leaked what they call the Black Diaries about his homosexual exploits. A lot of historians think they were totally fabricated. So he's a kind of amazing, tragic figure who kind of reappears. Sent my student off to the British Library to get pictures and to look at the West African Mail, which was E.D. Morell's newspaper. He also wrote a book called Red Rubber, and this is E.D. Morell, who's kind of the hero of King Leopold's Ghost. So Adam Hochschild is very colorful and compelling. It's sort of an unputdownable book. He describes E.D. Morell working for a shipping company, seeing these boats of guns going out from the docks of, I think it was Antwerp, and then what came back? Nothing except rubber and ivory, and saying to himself, there's something wrong. I need to investigate. So when I give this talk in journalism classes, some professor always pops up and goes, see, if you see something strange, you should always follow up in case it's a story. So I read King Leopold's Ghost, and then I thought, this is incredible. Like, what else? I had no idea. I'd heard of the Muckrakers. What incredible journalism was going on? Why didn't I know about it? So I kept reading, and it turned out that Jordan Goodman had written a book called The Devil and Mr. Casement. And it was the same sort of thing, that there was a gathering of rubber in the Amazon. The people working there were brutalized. It was the Peruvian Amazon Company, which was listed in London. And there was a local manager called, oh God, I don't even remember his name. But anyway, there's some local manager who was really awful. And Benjamin Soldano Roca, I think had some fight with him over money, gave up his job and started publishing a magazine about how bad this guy was. So he was just sort of campaigning all by himself in Iquitos, and 2 Americans came through and also had a run-in with the rubber company and brought the news back about all this atrocities and labor violations to London, where again the same thing happened, inquiry and investigations and fuss from shareholders. So one of the themes of the book is you've got these universal problems, right? Like labor violations, brutal treatment, slavery, trafficking, and yet police and military corruption, environmental, and only sometimes do journalists write about them, and only sometimes people pay attention to journalists. So that's one of the sort of themes of the book, is when does the journalism make a difference? Under what circumstances? What does it take? And the way I've divided the book is I have different stories from around the world on the same subjects. So I have a piece on trafficking in 1870, next a piece about trafficking from like 1990. I have Nike, Foxconn, Liz Claiborne, Kathy Lee Gifford, Liz Claiborne, all next to each other. So you can see the same stories over and over again. Famine in Ukraine, famine in West Bengal. That's the idea. I don't know, if you guys, I can show you all my slides, but you may not want to see them. So yeah, here's pictures from La Sanction, which was Benjamin Saldana Roca's newspaper. You can see, these are from the Bodleian. Jordan Goodman found them there. So this is the indigenous people being whipped, naked, tied up, mistreated. Julio Arana, the manager, is depicted as sitting on a safe containing skulls. This is 1907. It's a little bit after the same time as King Leopold's ghost. And then I wanted to know, like, what else was going on. So the next thing I started reading were all those books about the Cadbury boycott of 1906, which was news to me. I hadn't realized there was a boycott of Cadbury in 1906, or that there had been huge sugar boycotts in 1790 in England. I thought these were modern tactics. So all these rumors, as we've already talked about the Cadburys, they were abolitionists, they were anti-slavery people, they had given money to E.D. Morel and the Congo Reform Association, they had funded newspapers, and they were getting reports that their suppliers in Sao Tome and Principe were abusing the workers. I think that there was child labor, and that it was basically like slavery. Remember, slavery was officially over, but these conditions persisted. And they didn't know what to do, because obviously they wanted to clean their supply chain, as we'd say in modern language. And it took them about 8 years to figure out whether or not to take action, because of course things, again, one of the points I make in the book is, news travels faster now, even if it's ignored when it arrives. So in those days, it took years to actually get facts and information, which I don't think is a big difference from today. So in the meantime, the Evening Standard started running editorials saying, what's wrong with the Cadburys? Cadburys actually sued them. The courts upheld the Cadburys, but I think awarded them like a quarter of a shilling or something like that. And eventually, the Cadburys sent Wilbur Burt over to investigate. And he stopped in Porto to study Portuguese, so it took him 9 months to get there. And then he got there, and he was so stupid, he wrote back and said nothing to worry about, the kids have big stomachs, i.e. they're malnourished, but he thought they were well fed. So Henry Nevinson from The Atlantic, who'd written, Harper's, who'd written all that anti-slavery work reporting, went over himself and did a whole series. So that's excerpted in the book. And there was eventually a big, what happened was the Cadbury stopped, this is a sad story, the Cadbury stopped buying the cocoa from Sao Tome and Principe, so the Americans bought it instead. So it didn't make that much difference. So I don't know if you really want to hear about all my different characters, but what this slideshow does is I have pictures of some of the kind of great journalists and their stories. So I'll just skip through really quickly and not show you everything. So Dwarkanath Ganguly, again, exposed trafficking of coolies. Another problem is, after slavery was abolished, there were vast migrations of people from around the world, from India to the Caribbean, from China also to the Caribbean and to Africa. So they were sort of making up, everybody needed cheap labor supply after slavery was abolished. And Dwarkanath Ganguly is interesting because there was actually a sort of movement afoot in Bengal at the time of sort of Hindu reformers called Brahmo Samaj that wanted to modernize Hinduism, and they wanted to get rid of things like dowry and child brides. So again, in that theme of when does the journalism make a difference, one of the reasons his work really resonated was because there were a lot of people who were already working to kind of reform Hinduism. And of course that's one of the, pretty obvious, but one of the lessons of the book, right, is the journalism has an impact when there's already people who want to change something. But journalism can also help change the way the discussion is taking place and create the conditions also. So it's a kind of feedback loop. Here's some pictures of Jayita Sharma. She's a historian in University of Toronto, wrote a book called Empire's Garden. So these are some of the pictures that she sent in. Again, Brazilian classic. This is about the conquering of the hinterland of Brazil. So we have an excerpt from that by de Cunha. Albert Londres is the French journalist who wrote about Devil's Island. We have an extract from there, and that's the anti-colonialism. Gareth Jones and his writing on the Ukraine famine is really interesting because it made no difference whatsoever. He was actually a PR person who traveled on an organized trip to Russia. Again, that theme of how do you he got away from the guides, went to Ukraine, saw what was happening, published loads of stories. Nothing happened. The next pictures are of starving children. So if you don't want to see it, shut your eyes, okay? Okay, let's skip past. So everyone here knows the theories about Amartya Sen and famine and democracy, right? All of you?
That democracy, that politics causes famine.
And what about the press? What did he say about the press? All right, yay, I'm telling you something new, thank you. Okay, so 1982, Amartya Sen, the Indian economist, Nobel laureate, sort of national hero, gave a speech called the Coromandel Lecture, where he argued you do not have famines in democracies because you have a free press. Press will serve as an early warning, and then press will humiliate, embarrass, and make sure that something happens, the government. So Amartya Sen looked at China, compared China to India. Said you can have huge famine, you've had huge famine in China because there was no free press. You could not have that in India because there is a free press. So I thought this was really interesting and decided to take a look at the press coverage in Calcutta during the 1943 famine to see whether Sen's theories actually held up. And what was so interesting, I had my researcher, Vanessa, in the British Library for 1 year reading all the coverage in English, was there wasn't, it turned out, the thing that Amartya, I guess, hadn't really mentioned, but there was no reason for him to have mentioned it, was that wartime India was actually under censorship. The British got the Indian newspaper editors together in 1942 and said, you be nice, the All India Editors Association, you know, we have the articles about it, said, be nice to us, we'll be nice to you. So they basically told the editors, you're not really allowed to cover this. And it was partly because, you all know about like Madhusri Mukherjee's work. They were terrified that if the Japanese conquered Bengal, as they had Burma, any information about where the food supplies were could be used. So they basically put a blanket coverage on all of this. There were a lot of communist magazines and pamphlets that did in fact cover the famine. There were also artists as well who wrote about it, and lots of people have memories. So Sajid Rai had made a movie decades later. There were newspaper cartoons at the time. But essentially, the sort of vernacular press in Bengal didn't cover the famine, and the Statesman and Amrita Bazar Patrika, which were the English language papers, editorialized quite a bit about it, but didn't really, but finally got fed up. And so in September ran those photos that you just saw. And those photos were huge, because those were pictures of starving people coming into the streets of Calcutta looking for food, which is what Amartya Sen remembers. And for us who've actually read all the press coverage, it's very dramatic. It was very dramatic to suddenly find those pictures after reading a year of newspaper articles that sort of editorialized about the famine. So those pictures were printed, and it immediately shamed the government. And they immediately started sending food aid, and then all the foreign correspondents started writing about the famine. So it's an interesting contrast with Ukraine. And again, in the book, that's part of what we consider. Sometimes the press coverage makes a difference, sometimes it doesn't. And in terms of scholarship, Amartya Sen's speech, a lot of people went off to try to verify his claims. So there's a number of his economists, like Tim Besley, for example, who've done sort of detailed studies of the Indian media and have found absolutely when you have more media, you have faster government responsiveness to things like famines and natural disasters, and much more accountability. It doesn't matter if it's in English or the vernacular languages. So as I say in the book, you know, a whole school of media scholarship was born. We have a section on environment and natural disasters, because again, as we all know from Katrina, that those are really important and can have a big impact on politics. Ernesto Seaman argues that it was really the San Juan earthquake that paved the way for the rise of Peronism in Argentina, because the government was really unable to deal with it. I have a little section on that. Anton Harbour, Drum magazine. It's a great sort of piece of Soweto culture. There's only 2 places in the US to read it. One's in Schomburg Library in New York, and the other one's in Chicago. So this was a really funny magazine that was published in South Africa under apartheid. They had articles about music, they had articles about culture. They had this weird series with little Martians like sitting on top of big mushrooms, which was very popular. But they also did some great investigative journalism. And Drum is still very much remembered today in South Africa. Henry Nxumalo, who was actually killed probably while reporting on a story, it's a bit uncertain, got himself arrested, and then wrote an expose about prison conditions. He also went to work on the horrible Bethel potato farm and wrote about that, and that started a boycott. So he's kind of a great hero in South African journalism. Some highlights. And so is Carlos Cardozo. Carlos Cardozo had been in exile in South Africa, and then when the FMLN took over in Mozambique, he went back. He worked for official media, got one of those cushy jobs working for the state news service, and he got so disillusioned by the corruption that he quit and started his own fax newsletter. And he was murdered also during his while working on a story. So he, Henry Nxumalo, these are some of the great heroes of sort of Southern African journalism. Here's his newsletter. And again, a lot of, we were talking about this at lunch, I'd say probably like 70–80% of the magazines and newspapers in this book don't exist anymore. And that was really interesting for me, because we always talk about building institutions, creating sustainability. Powerful media houses are able to sort of take on their adversaries. But here were all these people that were like outraged, started a newsletter, started a magazine, did it for 10 years, and then went and did something else. Or in some cases were killed in the process. I don't think that in this whole theme of corruption and things, we also include a piece by Rafael Marquez from Angola, who's just been on jail in trial this month. Nick Christoph's been writing about him. So actually, when I was in Joburg last fall for the Power Reporting Conference, they have an annual Carlos Cardozo lecture, and Rafael Marquez came and gave that lecture and talked about how one of the times that he had been in jail, Carlos Cardozo had written him a letter and said, "You are not alone." So one of the nice things about the book is that in all these places where journalism is sort of under siege, it's a nice reminder for people about some of their traditions, especially the younger journalists who don't know about this. Our contributors keep getting put in jail. Khadija was arrested in December. I think that Penn is just giving her a big award. Human Rights Watch has been doing a lot to help her. So she's also been writing about corruption, writing about the ruling family and all the money that they've been helping themselves to. So these are some of the characters in the book. Lubin Yanes also wrote a lot about corruption. He's interesting again because he was twice thrown out of the party. So young Chinese journalists really don't know him. When I was in Beijing recently, people said, why did you include him? But he was so important for so long. Patricio Verdugo. After Pinochet took over, a number of the opposition people in the military rounded up and put in jail. They expected themselves, some turned themselves in. They thought they'd go on trial. Instead, some of the top people in the military under Pinochet got an airplane and flew around the country for 3 weeks and shot them all cold blood in the middle of the night in the jail cells. And then planted fake stories in the paper saying they ran off, they were shot trying to escape. So Verdugo, who's a journalist, wrote this book that just reconstructs exactly what happened. It's not an entertaining form of journalism, it's like a legal document, and it was in fact used later when they decided to prosecute. Robin Hyde, another New Zealand, heard about the Maori. Sainath, most famous probably development journalist in the world, just left his job at The Hindu, writes about rural affairs in India. Female cutting. So anyway, you get the idea. So here's some of the sort of highlights. This is a really interesting story because this was actually research done by an academic that didn't have impact until he gave the story to Benjamin Skinner, who got it into Bloomberg Businessweek. So this was a Korean-owned, New Zealand-flagged fishing ship that was recruiting from Indonesia and totally underpaying and brutalizing the workers. And again, when we talk about what causes impact, obviously people that care about their reputations and when there's a form of redress. So New Zealand was a country that was not going to put up with this. So they changed their laws actually very quickly after the story came out. And some of the US companies that had been buying the fish decided to clean up their supply chain. And Glenn Simmons had actually been under a lot of pressure. And I think even the Koreans at one point were trying to hack his email. So being published in Businessweek helped a lot. So that's a story that had an impact. And then none of this will be new to you. So there were books, articles, and pamphlets, government investigations, and public meetings were where a lot of these stories circulated or were acted on. As I mentioned, there are a lot of similarities with today, so the institutions didn't endure necessarily. Again, what really surprised me, maybe it shouldn't have, was the close ties between NGOs and human rights activists and the journalists. We always say that it's new. Nowadays, if you want to know about labor conditions in Dubai for Filipino workers, the New York Times doesn't have the budget. You have to read an Amnesty International report. I hadn't understood that in the 19th century, those connections existed. And especially for labor stories. I would say there are probably more NGO involvement in labor stories than other kinds of stories. Again, national bias and interests of the proprietor were obviously just as important, if not more so, in the 19th century than they are today. So those would be some of my similarities. Yeah, that investigative journalism was written, I think I just talked about all that. So yeah, here's some examples. Like the Nestle's milk boycott, for example. We all think of that as a huge story. Turns out that the person who wrote the first NGO report also wrote the first newspaper article. So there were these close ties. As I mentioned, a lot of these didn't last as well. Yeah, and then there's all those questions of why do people suddenly decide to do something, right? So all these are universal problems. They've existed forever: trafficking, exploitation, even foot binding, which Anthony Appiah has written about in the Honor Code. And then I go through some of the different theories of what makes something cascade. So Clifford Bob would say marketing. Other people, like I mentioned, other people in society who are ready for change, and so the journalism is sort of a catalyst in a way. So like the French middle class, the Vietnamese middle class, they wanted to get rid of the French. When they were allowed to open newspapers, the first thing they did was use them to call for the French to leave. Cascade theory. I'd say it's almost clear to know when it's not going to have an impact, right? So when they're very closed authoritarian regimes, when you're exposing an entity that's not accountable in some way, maybe too big, like getting Walmart to budge, although now, of course, they're moving their salaries a little bit versus the Gap. Or look at Rana Plaza. The European companies were much more willing to sort of revisit the standards for their supply chains than the US companies were. They just weren't. Again, sometimes coverage makes no difference because it's addressed to the wrong people, or you have governments that don't actually care about international opinion. And then I would say when you have structural and economic interests that are just too entrenched, right? I mean, we know that the banks and the hedge funds caused the 2008 financial crisis. We can't get any decent regulation. To me, it's a perfect example of when having information actually doesn't really make much difference. They've been opposed to Dodd-Frank. They keep being opposed to Dodd-Frank. So I remind people that having information or data doesn't mean things are going to change, right? And then exactly, I talk about things like when does it make a difference? So when there's mechanisms for redress, like courts or elections, obviously there have to be multiple stories and prolonged coverage. I can't think of a single case where one story made a difference. Although Under the Dome in China, I mean, that's having a huge impact right now. When change is in the air anyway, and then when it's easy to make a difference. So I think that's part of the success of social media, right? That one corrupt official is sort of low-hanging fruit. So everywhere in the world, social media is exposing the guy who let the local official's kid into college and not the other kid, or the spoiled, you see these stories like Indonesia, Mexico, China, the spoiled kid of the politician who ran somebody over, for example, or the politician with the big watch, right? That was exposed in both China and Mexico. So it's one person. I think that coverage can very quickly do something. As I started giving my talk, these are my last two slides, I got the same question everywhere, which was how many journalists in the book were killed. So we ended up doing a little chart, and it keeps getting out of date because people keep getting arrested. So that we know of, and it's not always clear. It looks like 4 people from the book were killed. And again, not always clear whether it was while they were working on the story. 5 imprisoned, again out of date because we just had a couple more people put in jail in the last couple months. And that we know of political pressure, although it was almost surely higher. And when I speak to groups of younger journalists, I always ask them how many journalists were killed last year, and nobody ever knows. And the answer is about 70, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. IPI uses larger figures because they include other media workers like drivers and fixers. And so as a result of talking about the book, I've also been, ended up talking a lot about investigative journalism around the world and press freedom. So that's also part of what I talk about now. Good, thanks. Thank you very much. Should I turn this off? Or do you want to?
Sure. Are you doing a Q&A?
I am doing Q&A. I just didn't know if you wanted to film it. Okay, great. Lovely. Thanks.
How did you pick the stories that you chose?
Great question. So it was about 4 or 5 different ways. One was subjects that I just knew were really important, like, or had always been curious about, like, again, the Bengal famine, the Nestle's milk boycott. All of those Nike were sort of key stories that I just knew I wanted. Then the other way was through all the reading, coming across stories that seemed important or journalists that seemed important. And then at some point, I started asking everybody I knew. So I wrote to everybody I knew all around the world and got ideas from them. And what was hard was everybody could remember, journalists can remember like the last 20, 30 years, and historians know like the 19th century, but I definitely felt that there wasn't quite enough in like the 1930s, 40s in this book, or 50s. So I was pretty worried about gaps. And I think one thing that really surprised me when this came out was really nobody has told me I'm missing anything, which shocks me. I assumed I'd have to have missed something somewhere. And I think when I went to Malaysia, so I'm keeping a little list, like when I went to Malaysia, someone said, oh, we had this amazing journalist who was writing in the 50s. So I'm keeping a list, and if we go into a second edition, then I'll do some ads. So I always tell the audience, my publisher said if we sell 7,500 copies, we can go into a second edition. So I always tell everyone, if you could each buy 100 copies, we will get there faster. And I had a few sort of criteria. So first of all, I'm a bookworm, and it had always been my dream to edit an anthology, so I wanted something readable. That was critical. So lots of worthy, important stories that weren't entertaining, I just wasn't going to include them. And I really wanted it to be from developing countries. So when I had a choice between a journalist from a developing country or someone from the US or Europe, I always went with the developing country. Now sometimes I didn't have a choice, like the LA Times piece on the Unocal pipeline in Burma. That's because it was so, the climate there was so repressive, there just wasn't any Burmese coverage. But where I could, I went local.
So you mean when you found an issue, you looked for like reporters in the local?
Sometimes, yeah, or the other way around. I'd say to people, who were the key local journalists, or what were the big stories? So, my co-author in Mozambique sort of said, you can't not have Carlos Cardozo, and I just thought he fits so beautifully with Rafael Marquez. It's fantastic. Or my dad, who's published a lot of books about China, was like, don't forget Liu Binyan. So then I went and found the right person to write about Liu Binyan. So it was pretty unscientific. One big problem was when I started emailing everybody in the world saying, send me ideas, everyone started sending me corruption stories, and they were all the same. They were all the president's son or the president's wife or the president's daughter is giving licenses to businesses. She has offshore bank accounts. There's all this corruption. And the problem with those stories is that they were so kind of bitsy and technical that they weren't interesting for an outside reader. And they would unfold over many, many parts. So they were tough. And at one point, there's a wonderful Nigerian journalist called Musekilo Mujid, who used to be with Next 234, and now he's with Premium Times. And someone said to me, you've got to do something. He's done so much great corruption story, you have to do it. And he'd done a series on this Nigerian minister, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Alison Maduke. So he sent it all, he sent, I can't remember who, someone sent it all to me, and me and my sort of researcher sat there and read it all. We're like, it's so important, but we just can't really figure out what to excerpt. So at some point I Googled, and the first thing that came up was a story in the London Independent about this minister saying that she was the new head of the anti-corruption ministry and she was going to clean up Nigeria and she was wonderful. And I had this 12-part series about how corrupt she was. So I wrote to the British journalist and I said, what do you think? And he said, he was very nice, he wasn't defensive, he said, oh, that's funny. You know, I'm going on vacation, but I'll check. So while he was on vacation, I started asking everybody I knew in Nigeria. I asked like the central bank governor, the finance minister, all these people. And nobody wanted to say in email, this woman's corrupt. So I got back all these emails that said, that's a very good newspaper. That journalist is very well respected. And finally, one of Charles Saludo, the former central bank governor, said to me, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to contact her office for you. And I thought, is that helping me? So there we were. And so Zach and I were sitting there reading them all and looking at excerpts. And then we finally thought, you know, this is such an important series, but it's just not going to be interesting enough for an outsider. You know, it's too inside baseball. So we decided not to use it. And then the British journalist gets back from vacation and says, I checked. And I must say that that's a very good newspaper. I think I was mistaken. And then, so we decided not to use the piece. A week later or something, we get an email from this minister's lawyer, very, very legalistic, saying, we will sue you if you run this piece. And of course, we had just decided not to. So I was really annoyed. And I can't remember if we'd already were in proof. So I sort of took a few months before I wrote to them and said we weren't using it. So that was the kind of thing. And it became, surprisingly, which I didn't expect, in many places, it became sort of prestigious. So I would get email from people, you know, I want to be in the book, or why wasn't I in the book? It became a little bit like a journalism prize. And in many, many countries, where people don't necessarily get global recognition, it became this nice thing for them, yeah, to be in the book. Unfortunately, it can be used badly, like this piece Zaman just did, where they have my picture next to Baransu, and you know, I had no idea. So definitely there's local like political tiffs that I'm sometimes getting slightly embroiled in. Like I have a horrible review on Amazon by somebody who really hates Horacio Verbitsky, who did this, I'm sure you all know, he did a really, really important piece of journalism about when the junta was actually pushing people while alive out of helicopters into the water. It was an awful, awful atrocity, and it was an incredible piece of journalism. And now Verbitsky is actually very pro-government, and the government, of course, in Argentina has been very anti-media and has gone after Clarín. So now in Argentina, people are like, why do you have a piece by him in your book? So that's something that comes up sometimes. You know, when good journalists turn bad and they're in the book, people get unhappy. Long answer, sorry.
No, this is great. I mean, thank you, first of all. This is
so
interesting. I have a couple questions. The first, actually maybe building off of Ruth's question, is there a correlation when you look at the success, like what gives success, if it's a indigenous journalist versus an out-of-country journalist? Because it looked like you have a couple examples in the ones that you cover where it's somebody coming in and reporting from outside who can really rattle the cage versus someone who can speak to it from a native voice. I mean, is there any correlation in terms of the success?
That's a great question. I don't know sort of scientifically, I've never done any data on it, but I'll have a few thoughts. One is that it's often the outsider that's freer. There's so many examples of cases where, like, I'll give you a perfect example. Wall Street Journal broke the story about Richard Grasso being overpaid, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, but then, obviously needing access, being pro-stock market, you know, never did anything about it. The FT put it on the front page for like months until finally there was an outcry and something was done. So as you know very well, if you're inside, if you're a beat reporter, if you need access, often the local journalists won't necessarily cover something the way an outsider will, or they don't want to hurt the people that they're reporting on, and they know that if it's a closed regime like Vietnam, you know, we often didn't name sources when we interviewed them, even though we could have, because we just knew that they would get in trouble later, and we tried to protect them. So I think outsiders can often be more open. I think in sort of situations with closed new systems, very repressive governments, like Arvind Ganesa from Human Rights Watch talks about how, say, in Angola or some of the closed African countries, if you got a story in the Portuguese newspaper, right, that the locals couldn't report. Then they could report it because it was in the Portuguese newspaper, and then it would sort of reverberate. So that sort of outside embarrassment can often be very powerful, whereas, say, Nigeria, where there's so much coverage about corruption, everyone's so immune to it, news reporting doesn't necessarily make a difference. So sometimes an outsider can seem more kind of authoritative and important. But then also there's many, many cases where it's only the locals that actually know what's going on, or know how to get the leaks, or know who to embarrass as well. I mean, Vietnam, we used to say all us foreign correspondents could say whatever we wanted, but we didn't know anything. And the Vietnamese journalists knew everything that was going on and weren't allowed to report any of it. So often what really works is when people get together as well.
That's true. I can imagine those partnerships are powerful. Building off of the language, that's my second question. I love how you are looking at the then and the now and doing those comparisons. And I have a question around literacy and not only just the use of language, but also who can actually read what's being printed. And
that's right.
My sense is that if you're looking back to the 19th century and thinking about that Calcutta article, that there are more people in India now that could actually read that than there were at that time.
That's right.
And so I'm wondering if you saw that in your research, that certain newspaper markets are booming in a way that isn't happening in this country as literacy increases in parts of the global south. And so has that had an impact in terms of stories being able to compel?
Absolutely. Yeah. So of course, when you're looking at change, as we were talking about before, there's sort of the grass tops, right? So even if just a few people can read, targeting those people can make a difference. So that's certainly what was happening with a lot of, the anti-Congo, the treatment, right? It was about getting a few people to sort of be outraged and do something. But yes, is the newspaper, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, places like Brazil and India were absolutely booming, absolutely booming. They had an emerging middle class, more and more people were reading. Places like India becoming middle class means buying a newspaper. Things like Bombay expanding, and so people on the train and commuting, and internet penetration not having risen. As much. So absolutely, somewhere like India, somewhere like Brazil, somewhere like China, these were enormous booming newspaper markets until a few years ago. They're now having a lot of the sort of layoffs and financial cutbacks that the media is having in the West, but not nearly as bad, of course. Yeah, no, definitely. So lots of places, or Kenya, there's just a lot more sort of news consumption than there was. Yeah.
I'm curious, in the research, particularly like 100 years ago, was there a discourse about press freedom that went alongside of these stories? Or is this a new thing that really did take shape?
Yeah, the person who really knows about this, and would be you, because I think France, right? Wasn't press freedom and newspaper culture incredibly important in France?
Yes and no, at least not in the sense that we would think about it nowadays. And so France sort of had a very long post-war period under the thumb of de Gaulle.
Yeah, but even, I thought in the late 19th century.
So you certainly had a discourse there, and you had major mass circulation newspapers that were larger than the New York Times now. But I'm curious, for instance, in a campaign, so say you're talking about a campaign to ban X practice in Y country.
Yeah.
To what extent, nowadays when there's a campaign, there's also usually a corresponding discourse about, don't crack down on the journalists, right? So there's a campaign to do something in Turkey, but there's also this corresponding discussion about Turkey's jailed more journalists.
Right.
And so I'm curious, is this something that the Committee to Protect Journalists has bequeathed to us nowadays? Or is there been
That's a great question. I'll tell you, I can just sort of tell you some observations of what I don't know, but certainly what I've seen from the reading is certainly plenty of commentary and editorials and remarks about things like advertiser influence and people who complain, even in these sort of African newsletters or whatever, you will see little comments of, why is every picking on us? Why are people picking on us? Where it's just our job is to expose something. Don't blame us. Don't shoot the messenger. So I would say some of that existed for sure. And definitely a feeling of, journalists being sort of pushed around and we have to stick up for them. But when did rights freedom of expression for journalists as its own thing develop? That I don't know.
It's like,
really good question.
Yeah, because like in the U.S. case, it's like we always had the First Amendment, but it was kind of rediscovered in the early 21st century,
right.
or early 20th century, where all of a sudden a professionalizing class of people were assumed to have certain rights. And I wonder if there's like an internationalization of the First Amendment story.
I bet there was. That's a great question. Certainly in India, I mean, I've only read a few books on kind of censorship in India, but as you know, there was a lot of like case law and discussion about who's responsible, you know, the person owning the printing press or the editor, and that sort of shifted over time. And I can definitely send you some citations for that. And there was sort of one crucial court case in like 1790, I think in like Australia, which ended up sort of shifting the view of who was responsible in India. Another sort of interesting thing was that the Indians, a lot of the censorship in India was around preventing communal violence. So if they felt that an editor was inciting riots, they could punish him. And so if they punished like a Hindu editor, then they would go find a Muslim editor and punish him as well. And from what I understand, the most common cause of takedown notices today in India for online sites is actually the same thing, inciting communal violence. And of course, many places still have all those old British laws. So Nigeria or Malaysia have the old sedition laws. And in Malaysia now, they're talking about turning them into a Harmony Act. So Singapore, a lot of people kept that. So there's a lot of British case law that I do know. Yeah, but I wish I had more of an answer. That's a really, really good question. Cool. Any other
questions?
Thanks for coming.
Thanks again.
Great.
Thank you.
Not at all.